Uh, Start recording here. If it sounds like I am talking to a moron or to a child at some points here, it is because I am talking to myself. I find this stuff incredibly hard to understand, actually, and it was never explained well to me. So, anytime that I'm presenting on meter, I am basically talking to myself and trying to remind myself how it works because it's just that complicated. So do not feel like I am trying to insult your intelligence if I say things that are really obvious to you, because none of this is obvious to me. And I don't really know what any of your backgrounds are. Maybe some of you are big Germanic metricists. Um, but I will do my best to explain this as I have come to understand it. So let me just pull this up here. Okay, so if you've ever studied um, Old Norse meter. Again, I don't know if any of you may have studied meter in Old Norse or in other old Germanic languages, but here are some of the people who really do know what they're talking about and are some of the people I've read come to have an understanding of this. Um, I actually, if you can read German, I particularly recommend Eduard Sieber's work from the late 19th century, early 20th century. He really is the one who broke through on understanding how the system works. Um, the particular title that I cite there is public domain. You can find it online, and it's a nice short treatment of how the meter of the Eddaic poems works. There is also that last book that's cited there, The Meters of Old Norse Eddaic Poetry by Seiichi Suzuki. This is an enormous book, which in like typical academic fashion, he calls, a beginning or an introduction. Um, this guy, I mean, it is hard to underestimate or undersell how hard the work on this book was. This actually includes a scan of every single line of Eddic poetry. So he went nuts with this. Um, this book is so complicated that I would not read this first. Like this guy understands this stuff and like really understands it and is a genius beyond mortals. I would read one of these other people first. Artie Folk has an article in one of the recent books. I can't remember which one off the top of my head, but one of these recent compilations of essays edited by Carolyn Larrington. He has a nice short article about Etic meter that's pretty readable. I actually cite it in the further reading of the second edition of the Poetic Edda, but I can't remember the citation off the top of my head right now. I literally put this together since launch. Let's see how this looks. If you've read other early Germanic poetry, some of the basics of Old Norse poetry will look familiar. It is not that different from, at least Fornyrðislag, the most basic Eddic meter, is not that different from the meter of Beowulf and Old English or Helion and Old Saxon or Hildebrandtslied and Old High German. At least not different in terms of the patterns of alliteration or line types as analyzed by Sievers. The really big difference that you're going to notice right away is that Old Norse poetry is stanzaic. That is apparently an independent development within North Germanic, but the earliest to the latest Old Norse poetry is all stanzaic. Um, if you have encountered treatments of Old Norse poetry that include modern imitations of it, because there are uh, maybe this seems more common to me just because of the people that I've wind up interacting with, but there are people that try to imitate Old Norse Eddic styles and Skaldic styles. And I actually think that most modern imitators overdo the alliteration and overdo the kennings. They are not, it is not like, and I think this is sometimes how people sell it. It's not like alliterate everything that you can. It's not 10 terrible tyrannosauruses on Tuesday, take down the tower, right? It's there's a pattern to it, but and it's not just do it everywhere that you can. It's also don't just do kennings everywhere that you can. It's a lot of kennings, but actually not very much in Eddic poetry. Kennings are really much more of a Skaldic poetry thing, and we'll get to that. But one other thing that I definitely need to establish right at the top is what is a line? Um, Lines to a certain extent are in the eye of the modern editor. There at the bottom, you can see a page from the Codex Regius of the Poetic Edda. That's a page from Thrymskvida. And I have the stanza printed two different ways above it. One is the 8-line presentation, which is typical of Scandinavian editors, and one is the 4-line with caesura presentation, typical of English and German editions. So typically, if you pick up Beowulf, say, it's going to be printed like this, with what from a Scandinavian perspective is 2 lines paired together as 1 line with a caesura between them. One presentation isn't wrong or right. This is just a different attitude. Are we looking at lines or are we looking at half lines? Since I was trained by Scandinavians, I always present this in the Scandinavian way as 8 lines rather than 4 sets of 2 half lines. But keep in mind, you're going to see it both ways out there in the wild, and one isn't necessarily, more or less correct than the other. This is just a difference of editorial attitude. Okay, another thing that's important to point out is when we're talking about syllable counts in Old Norse, they count as a syllable only what has an actual vowel or diphthong in the nucleus. So we don't know if all of these, if you already know from looking at Old Norse in class and perhaps outside of class, tons of Old Norse words end in R, right? Like it's the most common ending for nouns, it's the most common ending for verbs. We don't know at different periods how exactly this was pronounced, whether this is syllabic, right? Are they saying Fjaðrhamr, right? Is that 4 syllables as pronounced in just everyday language? Or is that still 2 syllables? Is this Fjaðrhamr or something like that? Is this actually fully merged with R, or is this still a Z color? Is this Fjaðrhamr or something like that? We don't really know. But in poetry, this R is not ever treated as a syllable. So this is a 2 syllable word as far as poets are concerned. And that's something that can be a little bit, uh, I don't know, it can confuse you a little bit early on scanning because you want to see that as 4 syllables and it's 2. I see a question or remark.
Yeah, a question for me. Of course, French allows R's and L's at the end of the words to just be one word. So, what's a notre? It's not notre. It's not 2 syllables. It's 1 syllable. And I think Wiktionary actually automatically treats them all uh, as monosyllabic for Old Norse as well. Though I
Okay.
think that may just be on the basis of metrical evidence like this. Of course, Icelandic is going to eventually make these into separate syllables. Uh, so, but do we? But the scholarship doesn't have a decision on whether this is phonetically real, at least in the period of the Edic period,
I don't know
or
how you could get to that answer, right? Because they're so consistent about it in poetry. But is that tradition or is that actually reflecting how they're still pronouncing it? So I also cited French as an example of where you can
oh
have
yeah,
a final R, right? Sant, something like that. And this Svara Bhakti vowel, so this Fjaðrhamr is going to become Fjadorhamr, right, in modern Icelandic. We start seeing that Svara Bhakti vowel really as early as about 1300, but it's not common until the 1500s. If you're looking at our sort of classical old Icelandic text, you're never going to see that Svara Bhakti vowel. I infer from that that there is not a vowel pronounced here until the 1300s or so. However, I suspect that somewhere, the 1100s or 1200s, at least by then, this has become its own syllable that people are saying, Fjaðrhamr. But a lot of this poetry, and this is kind of an interesting separate subject, a lot of this poetry has been dated, and a great deal of work has been done on this by example, Christopher Sapp in the last few years. A lot of this poetry has been dated, probably being composed orally in the 900s or so. Um, During the 900s, I suspect that, we're looking at a language where this really is just 1 syllable, however exactly that sounds, fjadr or fjadrish, something like that. Um, but the tradition of scanning it as 1 syllable lasts probably longer than it actually was 1 syllable. Anyway, it's worth keeping in mind we have to look for syllables with actual vowels or diphthongs in the nucleus, and it's never going to be one of these syllabic resonants, which the language is full of those resonants. All right, then another thing to establish early on is what alliterates with what. For the most part, this is pretty intuitive, right? You know, T's alliterate with T's, D's with D's, G's with G's. But note, and this is true of other Germanic languages too, all vowels alliterate with all other vowels. So uns vir utan kom osa garda, uns utan and osa all alliterate, ilts met osum, ilts met olvum, ilt os, ilt all alliterate. And then ya, spelled J, also alliterates with any vowel. Innan, Jotunheima, those are alliterating words. Early on, too, they will occasionally alliterate V with vowels. Not very often. In the last couple hours, I haven't stumbled on an example of it. You don't see it a ton, but you see it a little bit in early poems where that V, which is probably still a semi-vowel W at the time, is alliterated with vowels too. It really seems to be more like the early rule is semi-vowels alliterated with vowels. And then you don't have to be, here I am talking to you like you're trying to compose this poetry. Maybe some of you might try. You don't have to be super strict about consonant clusters. D alliterates with D regardless of what comes after the D. So thar kommer in demi dreki flugandi, demi dreki alliterate in spite of that R after the one D. Och han och sleipni sodal lagdi, sleipni sodal alliterate, mitti han helpi, thamesor helju kom, helpi and helju alliterate. The cluster doesn't matter. The only clusters that matter are S plus voiceless stop. So spa has to alliterate with spa, sta with sta, and ska with ska. The most common of those by far is ska. So skirar, vegar, ligger, skjolder, över. Skirar alliterates with skjolder. The rest of the sequence doesn't matter. Skirar can alliterate with like, skräma too. It's just that the S plus stop has to be the same. And then skeg namat hrista skor namat dia skeg skor or something. Yes.
Is it still so? The vowel alliteration across all vowels is normally explained that they had an epenthetic glottal stop that would show up in front of these words. I certainly know this is what Danka Minkova's analysis for Old English is, and then the transition between Old English and Middle English poetry into the iambic pentameter is normally explained by the loss of this epenthetic glottal stop, like we find in German. Do people believe this in Norse meter as well?
I don't know. Right. Like yeah, people talk about it, but like, how do you answer this? Because the analysis is still the same, whether you say that really it's a glottal stop that's alliterating or really it's a vowel that's alliterating, right? Um, I don't I don't know whether to postulate that there's necessarily a like perceived glottal stop at the beginning of these vowels in, say, Viking Age poetry.
I guess the question would be how frequently do you find contraction of vowel final words with vowel initial? And you certainly do when you're dealing with close Sunday situations, like in Hauslonger we had Urdut, which is, Urduat, and various other, Sas from Sa
Mhm,
plus
mhm.
S. But outside of those close Sunday situations, we don't find the other types of contractions that we might find in Latin or Greek meter.
I see what you're saying. So actually, that depends on the metrics that you're reading too. So, for example, Seiichi Suzuki never postulates uh, that kind of Sunday beyond what's actually reflected in the orthography. So he'll accept sauce, right? But he won't postulate anything further than that. Zevers is actually pretty aggressive about postulating that kind of Sunday, um, which I would say most metrists today don't seem to agree with, but he's very happy to let um, a lightly stressed word following a vowel final word to be elided with the word preceding it. So it seems like, for the most part, your modern metrics, your Artie Folks, your Suzuki's, your Nelson Goerings, they don't seem to postulate that, or at least don't find textual evidence for it. Uh, and it is notable that it's only a few certain words that we find in the orthography written with that kind of sandhi, S being the most common of them. Yeah. And then pronouns, right? Ek getting appended as K. Yeah. If that sort of answers what you're talking about.
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay. This is one of those parts where I have no idea what your background is, but I find that, doesn't necessarily hurt to remind people that is not a regular pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables that is the same for every line, like we often expect in the more sing-songy meters of modern English and other modern languages, right? Our iambic pentameter, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? We do not get that kind of routine pattern that's shared from line to line. Instead, each line has a particular pattern of lifts and drops. I'm usually going to use the term lift for stressed syllables, drops for unstressed syllables, but lifts can include more than one syllable, drops can include more than one syllable. So they're not exactly quite the same thing, and we're going to see what I mean by that in a minute. Those lifts and drops, however, only come in certain patterns. There is not an infinite variety of possible lines. There's a variety, and at first the variety can seem a little bit bewildering. I'm going to hopefully try to reduce some of that bewilderment. Um, but there's not one pattern. Like you're not going to see you're never going to get this rhythmic sing song da 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 da, and it's going to be the same in every line. It's each line is going to be a little bit different from the one that precedes it. So in terms of lifts too, they really, and this is something that modern recreators often really struggle with, they really, really prefer to do all of their alliteration on nouns and adjectives. And they really, really want the lifts to be nouns and adjectives too. Your lift can be a verb, but if there's a noun or an adjective preceding it in the line, it is not a lift. Um, Verbs are only sort of lifts in the desperate absence of nouns and adjectives. Now, this is part of why, if you've ever read Old Norse poetry, or if you've even read the translations of Old Norse poetry, there's tons of adjectives, um, right? We hear so often about, and this isn't all that unlike some other Indo-European poetry, right? But we hear so often about, not just Thor, but like mighty Thor, not just Odin, but gray-bearded Odin. Like there's so often adjectives because they're having to throw those in to get these lifts and these alliterations. If a verb or a form of a verb is a lift and participates in alliteration, it is probably a past participle. Not surprising because it's basically an adjective, right? Um, so you'll find alliterating verbs, just not very much. And I think that's a big difference from English alliterative poetry because often in English, verbs do have fairly high tone in a sentence, right? Or in an utterance. Not so in old Semitic languages, apparently.
Does the infinitive behave differently? I mean, it's closer to a nominal in many cases than a finite form.
Yeah, I would say you see in like not as often as participles, but infinitives are a little bit more expected as lifts than it's an inflected verb. It's a present or past verb that's the really unexpected lift. One reason that infinitives are maybe a little bit less often lifts is that um, they tend to be light syllables, right? Bit, right? It's just a short vowel plus one consonant, and they tend more to go for heavy syllables for lifts, but there's not a hard and fast rule about that.
Of course, from an Indo-European perspective, we normally relate this to the unaccented verbs in Vedic Sanskrit and those clitic verbs in Greek. But
Mhm.
whether that's actually an archaism or an innovation in Germanic is still a matter of debate.
Yeah, like most things, right? I mean, like so often you just say, well, here's a question without having any kind of answer for it, right? Okay. So Edward Sievers in the late 19th century breaks the types of lines down into five types. If you learn these as hard and fast rules, you'll drive yourself insane trying to scan lines, though, right? Because they're not. Um, what these are like loosen up, let your hair down, put your hat on backwards, you know, just breathe in and accept that these are like kind of loose scaffoldings, and you'll feel a little bit better. So the most common type is the A type, where we get two lifts and two drops, and it's basically trochaic, right? Vitkar allir, golum lengi, vrikir tivar, breda steina. Since all words in Old Norse are emphasized on the first syllable, this is a really, really easy type to get because the language is basically trochaic, right? You very often have that emphasized first syllable and you have that grammatical ending as a second syllable. So this is super easy to do. There are a lot of subtypes, and if you read Zevers or if you read Suzuki, you're going to find, like, well, this is A, but this is like A2B, this is AK1, etc. Right? And learn trying to memorize all that stuff, like it can drive you crazy. Um, I think that it's a little bit kinder on yourself, especially at the beginning, to think of this as more like, okay, our ideal A line is two trochees, but as long as it ends in a trochee and that trochee is not preceded by another full lift, so basically anything that ends drop, lift, drop, or even like half drop, lift, drop is still an A line. So ein natr vega, that's still an A line because it ends in a trochee, and what precedes the trochee is not a full stressed line, a full stressed syllable. So a compound like ein natr, one night old, that first syllable, ein, is what bears the primary stress. There's a secondary stress on natr, the second element of the compound, but that doesn't count as a full lift. So this still constitutes an A line. Or likewise, heimrithu odin. We can always have an extra syllable in the first drop. That's always fine, as long as it's two low stress words, uh, or perhaps a low stress ending on a low stress root. It's fine to have two syllables in that first drop. So heimrithu odin, even though we have five syllables, this is still an A line. Ok verhróðigur, this is still an A line because we end in a trochee and it's preceded by a drop. We don't have two lifts, but occasionally we do see just these one lift lines, and they're often A lines that look like this. Suo come hermana, we have three unstressed syllables preceding our trochee. This still counts as an A line because we have a final trochee and it's preceded by a syllable that is not a full lift. You can get into, again, it would take hours to go through all of these, what exactly these subtypes are called. But just to break it down, the thing that makes it an A line is final trochee, not preceded by another lift. So A is the most common type, our final trochee. Our next most final type is also a final trochee, but it's preceded by an IAM. So it's unstressed, stressed, stressed, unstressed. Frá viðoldi, ok, ó Signor, ok, Galdersfather, kné falla. Now you may notice that this is a little hypocritical because I'm counting the in, the second element in this compound, as a full lift. And they are hypocritical about this. They can count the second, they can count the second constituent of a compound as a full lift or as a half lift. And there does not seem to be much rhyme or reason for this beyond what the meter requires. I have not been able to detect a pattern to like what words have their second constituent counted as a full lift versus a half lift. There doesn't seem to be any consistency about it. And then probably next most common is the B type, which is IAMs. So da 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 da, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed. So Ríður Ragnasjot of Bruggenmjölr, han Engemaður. Not so many of these, but they're out there. When you see these, by the way, this is pretty characteristic of Eddic poetry. Skaldic poetry has very, very little of this because Skaldic poetry uh, is pretty much built on those final trochees. So A and C are pretty much de rigueur in Skaldic, although those lines are longer too. And then you have D and E, which are various other combinations, more or less that's the easiest way of putting this, of lifts and drops. The D type is distinguished by beginning with two full lifts. So very often that's monosyllabic lift followed by the root of another word that's either a compound or multisyllabic. Men brisinga, long tíðindi, ver gjarnasta, alla ossasala. This subtype is not very common where we actually end on trochee ol ulf loki. That's pretty hard to find examples of. And then the E type is we start on a lift. We do not then have another full lift, unlike in the D type, and we typically end in an IM. So long nivjatal, nivel heljartil, nosorden qua, thor qua thor. And then this is a fairly uncommon subtype where the second syllable is a full drop, froyo at kvan. That's not very common. But if you learn to watch for these, and I think that it probably helps more to learn examples of each type than it does to learn the slashes and X's that I typically use to mark lifts and drops. You can start scanning pretty well. But let me show you some more examples because you need examples to see it. Okay, and one more thing too. In especially C lines, the first lift, not the second lift, but the first lift very often has what's called resolution, which is to say that the lift is composed of more than one syllable. It's a two-syllable lift. This, however, can only happen within certain phonological constraints. That first syllable has to be a root syllable that contains only one short vowel, cannot be a diphthong, cannot be a long vowel, and it can only be followed by one consonant. So, and then the second syllable has to be a grammatical ending. So it's always going to be a short vowel. So frekke, himmen, hovud, these are two syllables, but they're one left. So this is extremely common in our C lines, our IM plus trochee lines, or da lines. And frekke rena, oko himmen verpa, ne hovud kembir. Hovud, himmen, frekke, counting as just one left. And notice here we have two drops, but this is really, really common. Anacrusis, extra unstressed syllables at the beginning of the line. You basically get like one free extra unstressed syllable at the beginning of the line if you want it. And in some meters, we're going to look at the other halter, and then we're going to look at some skaldic meters where it's like limitless. You can have like 5 extra unstressed syllables at the beginning, and there doesn't seem to be a pattern to it. What kind of matters as far as classifying your line is how the line ends. Right? Does it end in a trochee that's preceded by an unstressed syllable? Then it's an A. Does it end in a trochee that's preceded by an IM? Then it's a C. Does it end in an IM? Then it's a B. Do we have lifts that touch each other? Then it's D or E. Other than in the middle, it's a C. Okay, so one stanza that I really like for remembering Fornir the Slag, and this is the one that I tend to go back to myself and like reminding myself how this works, is this repeated stanza that we have in Volaspá. Gaur nu garmjok för gnippa helle, festermun sletna and frekke renna. This is the first half of it. I'll show the rest of it on the next slide. This is a good example of Fornir the Slag. So the meter of old works. This is the typical meter for narrative poetry in the Eddas. So if you're reading Volaspá about the creation and destruction of the world, or you're reading Thrymskvida about Thor getting his hammer back, you're reading Hymiskvida about Thor and Tyr going to fetch the cauldron, that's in Fornir the Slag. This is pretty close to the same meter as the meter of like Beowulf or the Heliond. Although Zevers and Suzuki both point out 2 degrees of specificity that don't belong here. There are certain kinds of subtypes of lines that are more common in Old Norse than are common in Old English, Old Saxon, but the meter is functionally the same. So just to look at this with our types, we start with an A. So gornu garmjok, right? Lift, drop, lift, drop. Then we get a C with a resolve first lift. Fyr gnipaheli, drop, two syllables together functioning as one lift, lift, drop. Then we get another A. Festr munsletna. Da, 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 da. Then we get another C with a resolve first lift. This is super common in C. En frekerena. This counts as one lift. If we keep going, fjolvetic fröda. Here we have an A with two unstressed syllables constituting one drop. That's really, really common. The first drop very often includes a second unstressed syllable. You can call that a resolved drop. Some people, I guess, don't like using the term resolution for when two unstressed syllables count as a drop. I don't know. It can be a convenient way to think about it for yourself. Okay. And like I said, I'm talking to myself here as much as I'm talking to anybody. From seek lengra, same thing. Seek is counting as one drop. Now, this is one place where Zevers, who's really happy to cut syllables by adding by by contracting and making epenthetic pronouns, he'll actually just write this as like fjord vetk for the from sek lengra, right? And sure, maybe that was the intention of the poet. I don't know. But the manuscripts don't say that. So I think that it's a little bit safer to, write something a little bit more like what the manuscripts say. Ragnarok, that's a B. I am Ragnarok. And then we have a D, Rom Sigtiva, where we have two lifts bordering each other at the beginning of the line. I really like this as a sample stanza because it reflects the frequency of line types pretty well in Four Near the Sog. Lots of A, lots of C, a little bit of B, not a ton of D and E. Yes, over there.
Yep, me again. This question about the resolution on the drops for Vaitk or Sik. I mean, I believe that they're pronounced separately, but they do probably form a close prosodic unit.
Hmm.
Um, is Do we know whether this is common for these resolved drops, that they tend to be things like verb, pronoun?
Oh yeah,
Uh,
verb pronoun is absolutely dominantly what this is. Yeah, it's Vedek Sayak. Yeah, yeah. Which presumably, even if they aren't saying it as one word, they're saying pretty quickly together.
yeah.
And Vedek
Because
Sayak.
we do see special Sunday for these verb plus pronoun things all over the place, especially in the
Yeah.
passive, middle passives, right? So,
Yeah, and this is not unknown. We have plenty of examples of it. We just don't have it as this particular poem is written down. So I would represent it that way, and it certainly scans basically the same way. But in the manuscripts, these words are written separately, so I'm writing them separately here,
yeah.
just because I'm trying to be less aggressive about emendation. Zevers is pretty aggressive about it.
I'm sort of taking a compromise position here, which is to say, yeah, they probably pronounce them separately, but they did probably bind together fairly closely in when you're calculating, phrase structures.
Oh, sure.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. I think that's pretty hard to object to. Now notice also the alliteration pattern. So the first lift in each even line is going to alliterate with at least one lift in the previous odd line. Doesn't really matter which one. Often the first one, but there's no reason it can't be the second one. I think that may be one of the slight differences from Old English, where Old English more often favors the first one. But the but both of them in the odd line can alliterate. It is not really ever seen that the second one in the even line alliterates. It's really just the first one. So here we've got gur, garm, knip. Here we've got festr, frek. Here we've got fjold, fröd, fram. And here we've got rag, rom. So each couplet is an independent alliterating unit. You do not alliterate the same way through the whole stanza. You might, by coincidence, have two couplets that have the same alliteration follow each other. That does happen, but it's not it's not something they ever shoot for. And in fact, Snorri in the Prose Edda, uh, people forget that one third of the Prose Edda is dedicated to Snorri trying to explain how to compose Old Norse poetry. Snorri says that that's, like the better poets don't do that. Like you need to alliterate differently for every couplet. You don't alliterate the whole way through. So maybe that was something people judged. At least Snorri judged it, but Snorri judges lots of things. All right, so here's another example of a Forney the Slog stanza with the alliteration in bolds. We've got Hran her hjor. We got in ol, morn maur, slow sverth seventh, dyrt draugum. So you may notice that the way that I read that is backwards. When I'm looking for alliteration and I'm scanning, I just start on the even line and I just find that first lift because that's going to tell me what's supposed to alliterate in the previous one, right? It's reliably the first lift in the even line. But notice what we're seeing alliterate to. I don't have annotation tools, so I'll just do this with my little highlighter here. Names, thus nouns. Adjective. Here's a line where it's a little bit surprising. This is actually a preposition that's alliterating. Uh,
Hmm.
that's kind of surprising that we've got this noun hanging out back here that's not participating in alliteration, but it does happen. One thing I will point out is that if rivia preceded in on in this line, so this is within your ribs. If if rivia preceded in on the preposition in this line, rivia would have to be the alliterating syllable. So you can only not alliterate on the noun if you're pushing it back behind something else that's alliterating. Um, Morneth Maura. So we've got nouns. No, we've got noun and verb actually. And then noun, verb, kind of surprising. Noun, adjective. This is maybe a touch late. This is a stanza from Hervar Saga, Rex. Actually, the reason that it's here is that for about 5 minutes, I thought, oh, tomorrow's Halloween. I should find stanzas that have ghosts in them. Um, so, but it's maybe not the most perfect example, but it's fine for another song. Um, this is from The Waking of Angantyr, where Hervor breaks into the burial mound of her zombie dad and demands the sword that he was buried with, right? So she says, again, I've thrown this together since launch. Hervar Thruvar Thrani Angantyr, um, so may you feel that you rot with ants, Maur, inside your ribs, all of you, inside the mound, unless you give the sword which Dvalin made. It does not befit ghosts or zombies, Draugr, to carry a precious weapon. Yes, over there.
Yeah, thanks, Jackson. I'm just wondering, I'm looking down towards the bottom of this passage where we have Sverð and Seliv and Slow is followed by Dvalin, and then the next lines alliterate in D. I'm
Mhm.
just wondering if this sort of anticipation of alliteration happens often, or if there's any sort of organizational device to connect, I don't know, various lines of a stanza together in such a way. You might hit on that later. I don't know.
No, I would say, especially in Eddic poetry, this strikes me as an accident. In skaldic poetry, they get a little bit more playful like this sometimes, but in Eddic poetry, that doesn't strike me as something that's intentional. Um, it is slightly noticeable, right? Because as you say it aloud, that are slow dwalen samar eget draugum dyrt wapenbera. Those are all lifts, so I think you would notice it, but I don't believe that it's deliberate, or at least it's not typical.
And likewise, from 2 to 3, you have Angantud to Orlum
Yeah,
and
you're
stuff.
right.
You have these little. It sort of looks like it, but
Hmm.
uh,
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, look at me trying to get zombies in here and and thus bringing in stanzas that slightly undercut the typical features of this meter. Yeah. But yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's uh the fact that it happens twice, now that you're pointing it out to me, strikes me as something that maybe this person is doing deliberately, but it's not typical. And something that, especially in Epic poetry, I would actually say is like kind of weird. Like not, it's the fact that it happens twice here does make it look more deliberate. Let's see what happens in the other stanza from this poem that has a zombie in it. Does this happen again? Hogard Drow, Durham, Rathens Motham? No. So it doesn't happen in this one. So here we've got Brenneth Ball, Elda Ydra, Moyu Muntun, Draug Durham. So we're starting on a verb that has no noun in the line, uh, alliterating with a noun. Here we've got noun, pronoun, not something you super often alliterate on. Noun, 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 noun. This is a little bit more typical looking. So you don't burn the pyres so bright at night that I become afraid of your fires. The heart of this girl does not shiver, though she may see a zombie stand before the doors. Um, so if I were to render how I think that sounds in roughly 1200s Old Icelandic, I would say Brennið eigisvo bol og nóttum at ekvið elda ydra hradumsk. Skelvr egin möju muntun hugar þótt hon draug sjó í fjöldórum standa. To my mind, the effect of the alliteration is a little bit more subtle again than a lot of modern recreators go for. But your mileage may vary, as they say. Okay, so that's Fornir the Sog, and we can look at more examples of Eddic poetry too, if folks like, but let me at least point out the other major Eddic tradition, because this one has a lot less in common with West Germanic poetry types. This does not exist in West Germanic. So this is Ljóðháttr, so the meter of songs. And instead of our typically 8-line stanzas, a Fornir the Sog, although Fornir the Sog could be all kinds of lengths. I mean, this one is 10, right? So Fornir the Sog it's not religiously required to be eight lines, it just often is. And by the way, it seems like often it's older poems that more frequently have odd, not odd as an odd number, but have unusual counts of lines in a stanza, and that may be either an artifact of the stanzaic tradition not being quite as firmly established, or it may be a preservation problem where we don't, apparently short stanzas are actually just incompletely preserved stanzas. It's hard to decide between those two things sometimes. But Ljóðháttr is organized usually into 6-line stanzas. It is at least units of 3. And so I like to say that to students, if you're trying to scan and figure out what meter you're looking at, Ljóðháttr usually will stand out because it looks like triangles that get larger toward the bottom. Because what we've got are 2 lines that are going to be shorter than the 3rd line. Usually also the 2nd line is longer than the 1st line of the 3. This one is very typical looking. And another thing that's really, really characteristic of Ljóðháttr is lots of anacrusis, lots of extra unstressed syllables at the beginning of the line, especially in lines 2 and 3. My God, it can seem limitless. So confusingly, often people talk about this as A lines, B lines, C lines, which starts sounding like you're talking about types. But in our 1st and 2nd lines, which also, by the way, right, is 4th and 5th lines, in our 1st and 2nd lines, our types are going to look a lot like the types in Fornir the Sog. Just in the 2nd line, there's very likely to be lots of anacrusis, more than one unstressed syllable that's been accreted at the beginning. So Montu thought Odin, we've got an A with 2 syllables in the first drop. Then we have a C with 2 anacrustic unstressed syllables at the beginning, Erveti or daga. Same thing down here, we've got an A, Olvi Berge, typical A, and then we've got an A with lots of anacrusis in the second. lestu egi mundu. So there's a lot of emphasis in talking about the difference between for near this log and the other halter that emphasizes that third line that alliterates with itself and is extra long. But you already have a pretty big difference just in the second line. The second line is much more likely to have extra anacrusis than you're ever going to see in for near this log. So there's already something different there. But the thing that really stands out as marking out Leo the Halter is this third line, which doesn't alliterate with the preceding lines. It may, randomly, incidentally at times, but it's not intended to alliterate with the preceding two lines. So blendum blow these saman. We've got ba, and we can have an extra lift. They don't always have three lifts, but they almost always, again, are longer than the preceding line. So like down here, it's two lifts, but we have five extra. Well, one is an extra, I guess, because we can have a free one, but we've got five unstressed syllables before we get to the first lift, right? Nema akravari boldum boards. It's, it's anacrusis to blot out the sun. So this is from Lokasena, where Loki is insulting all the gods and the gods insult Loki back. So this is, do you remember Odin when in ancient days we blended blood together? You said that you would never taste ale unless it was brought to us both. And this is one of the typical use cases for the Ljóðaháttr. It features very heavily in dialogue poems like Lokasena. The other place that it features very heavily is in gnomic proverbial poetry. So most of Havamal is in Ljóðaháttr. And the only examples of Ljóðaháttr known are not just North Germanic, they're West Norse. We only know of this from Icelandic and Norwegian poets. It doesn't actually even seem to have necessarily broken into Sweden and Denmark, although that could be a preservation problem because most of our literature is West Norse. And then there is a variant of Ljóðaháttr that, again, because of people that I wind up interacting with because of what I do, I think of as being very popular. But it's really just a subtype of Ljóðaháttr that has extra of these self-alliterating lines. So this stanza became famous, at least in the world of people I interact with from the Vikings TV show. This is a spell from the end of Havamal. That kann ik elfta ef ik skalt orustu leiða langvinning. Undir randir gel en þeir með ríki fara. Heilir hildar til, heilir hildi frá, koma þeir heilir hvaðan. So we have line 1 and 2 alliterate with each other. This is an unusual amount of anacrusis for a first line. Then the third line alliterates with itself. Line 1 and 2 alliterate with each other. And then we have a third line alliterating with itself. But then Galdralag, which means meter of magic, meter of spells, adds extra of these self-alliterating lines. This example has all of those lines alliterating with each other, but they don't have to. The next spell from the same poem doesn't have that. So That kann ik tolfta ef ik sail tre uppi valva virgulna, svo ek rist och I runum folk att så gengar gumi och mäler with mig. So here we've got two extra, well, we have one extra self-alliterating line, but it doesn't alliterate with one before it. This is called Galdralag already by Snorri in the 1200s when he describes it in the Prose Edda. So he perhaps knows some tradition that associates it with magic. In fact, it doesn't seem to necessarily be associated with magical content. It's something of a coincidence that the first two examples that occurred to me are from Odin reciting his list of poems, but it's not like we actually see it used more often than anything else in spells and people doing things to each other magically. This is Odin talking about what he can do with magic, not him actually casting a spell. So I'm not exactly sure how the name occurred. In Lokasena, when they're talking to each other and just insulting each other, all the gods, including Loki, drop into Galdralog from time to time, and it doesn't seem like the content is supposed to be magical. Why does it matter if Loki is calling you? No, it's not. I can't really say any of the things that Loki says that he's calling people in polite company. But if Loki's insulting you, what does it matter if he's, you know, if it's the spell meter or not? I don't know. Yes, over there.
Doesn't this look a little bit like Merseburg Charm 2? It
Yeah.
has alliteration across lines, and then the last three are self-alliterating.
Yeah, that's
Um,
true.
um,
Let's take a look at that actually. For those who have not seen this. All right, first place I can find it is Wikipedia, which 20 years ago I thought of as like, oh, don't ever go there. And now I'm like, thank God for Wikipedia, actual human edited internet. Um, but yeah, full in the world and war and Holza. So, do our, yeah, I see what you mean. It's down here, right? Ben se bena, blot se blota, lead se geleden, so se gelima de sin. With this self alliteration, is that what you're talking about there? Ben Renki
yeah,
blot.
and
Yeah.
so you get a speed because in the first half you have your narrative section where you have them riding in the woods and he messes up his foot, and then you have the so and so conjured it with an alliterative the identification of who they are in the next half line, and then you speed up the content at the end where you actually get the magical text, which is then self-alliterating to a certain extent. I only thought of this because we were talking about magical poetry, where sort of at the end you get the condensed magical form.
Yeah.
But
No, I got to
um,
say that's rad, and I'd never thought about that. I don't know if there's anything that's been. I would guess somebody has thought about this before, right? Like it's my first thought anytime I have an original idea. But that's a cool parallel. I hadn't thought about it. All right, so perhaps there is some kind of predecessor there that you're seeing, because I mean that's got to be, what are the dates on these things usually believed to be?
and I mean that particular language, the bone to bone, marrow to marrow, sinew to sinew, is very well
Oh yeah.
attested in Vedic materials. Kuhn has an entire article where he talks about the Old English versions of this same hymn that have all been Christianized in various ways, where Jesus and Saint Peter are walking in the woods and they have to heal a horse again. So
And I'm
um,
I'm pretty
this
sure,
particular one has to be very, very old.
yeah, I'm pretty sure Adams uses an example of pretty much the same formula from Tocharian, right? I mean, it's a pretty widely distributed uh, motif, right? The bone to bone, blood to blood, limb to limb thing. I'm pretty sure. I can't remember, but I believe I saw that once.
Of course, it's Sanskrit, and that might be the source of the.
Hmm? I didn't hear
So
you.
It's there in Sanskrit, that could be the source of the Tocharian.
Oh yeah, that's true. That's true. Because so much of that literature is Buddhist literature copied from Sanskrit and Pali, right?
Yeah, of course, it depends on where it occurs. So,
no, these are the Vedic materials, mostly in the Arundhati hymns in the Atharva Veda.
Mhm.
So specifically healing charms associated with this healing goddess, whoever you want her to be.
Hmm. That's cool. I hadn't thought about the Meersburg charm parallel, and now you're going to get me thinking about that quite a bit. So thank you for that thought. Um, Again, we can come back and we can look at more examples of Vedic poetry. Uh, Let me know if that's of interest to people. We can go through some stuff, but let's also talk about skaldic meters, and in particular, the most prominent called Drottkvat, the uh, the court meter, because this is where Old Norse poets just go wild, right? This is a very different tradition from Eddic poetry, right? I mean, like when I probably sound maybe excessively jokey depending on what your tastes are when I say like, all right, this is A-ish with anacrusis to blot out the sun, right? That is pretty much my official scansion of this line. Um, but that seems to be about as loose as they were, right? It's like as long as we're broadly falling into these broad line types, nobody really cares. Yeah, knock yourself out with some extra unstressed syllables at the start. But somewhere apparently starting around the 800s, because we have skaldic poetry that appears to date that early, someone decides this is not good enough for talking about how awesome the king is, and develops this much stricter skaldic type of meter that involves counted lines, counted syllables within the line, specific syllables that have to alliterate, specific syllables that have to rhyme, and specific syllables that have to half rhyme, that is, end in the same consonants. So this is a really, really different tradition. Skaldic meter, I think, influences a lot more of what people believe about Old Norse poetry, just because somewhere someone has heard about how strict this is and how much alliteration there is and how many kennings there are. Drokfat is where you get the insane kennings. Eddic poetry, like something like Volaspá or Havamal or Grímnismál, you're going to have like three kennings in the whole poem. Drokfat, you're going to have like a kenning or two or three in a stanza. Yes, over there.
Hi there. Uh, Thanks for doing this. I was wondering, sorry, I was wondering what your sense is of how derived the Skaldic tradition is from Eddic meter, because this seems in many ways to parallel the division that you could point to in Greek poetry and Vedic poetry, where there's sort of like epic narrative poetry, which is fairly simple, subject to being changed up, versus occasional poetry that's kind of set in stone, very complicated, obscure. And since those exist like that, I was wondering, uh, you say that this Skaldic tradition is quite separate from the other tradition, but we don't seem to have evidence of it in the rest of Germanic. So I was wondering how derived you think of Germanic.
Well, I think that the example that you reduced there is extremely relevant, right? I mean, the difference between narrative versus occasional poetry. I mean, and it's striking that the parallel is so close, right? You have your sort of looser narrative style and you have your very strict occasional style. What strikes me is exactly something else you mentioned, that we don't find this in the West Germanic tradition, right? There is, as far as we know, there's not Old English Skaldic poetry. There's not, Old High German Drochkrat. Why does this develop just in Scandinavia? One possibility, and I am not much of a Celticist, so I can't get into the nitty-gritty of this, but one possibility is that this is influenced by some Old Irish occasional poetry that is strict in a similar way, with particular requirements for syllable counts and rhyme and things like this. I have never become quite capable enough with Old Irish, regrettably. It's actually something I work on occasionally. Um, be able to talk to you about the specifics of that, but it's possible that this results from contact with Celtic speaking peoples and absorbing some of that tradition, which then may go back to that Indo-European division and it's being sort of reintroduced into the Norse world. I don't know. These these Skaldic styles owe something to the Eddic styles before them. The pattern of alliteration is similar. What alliterates is similar. What counts as a syllable is similar. So they're not totally divorced from it. But it does seem to appear kind of suddenly in the Viking Age and only within the Scandinavian tradition, as opposed to the Eddic-like tradition, Fornyrðis-like tradition that's shared with all of the Germanic peoples.
But both of these have to be inherited functions of the poetic, the poetic families. Like you have to have your remembrancers who know the epic histories and know the laws, but also can be called upon to provide praise poetry. And so, even if it's not the same, directly inherited, do we then just say, well, the type of praise poetry has to come up again, and so they need to re-innovate it? The same sort of problem happens in the Sanskrit world, where you have all of the Vedic praise hymns, and then you have epic, and then it's sort of the tradition disappears for a while, and then you have kavya show up all over again, where extremely elaborate poetries and frequently praise poetry and love poetry just reappears? And is it the case that they were just hiding from us in the historical record, or it's just that this is the type of function that these poets had to do, and so they're always going to be recreating this sort of function even if they lose it?
And that's worth pondering because I think that if you look at the Old English tradition, it seems that that role of praise poetry is being occupied by Eddaic-like meters, right? I mean, there's not much difference metrically. As I understand it, perhaps a really specialized Old English metricists would disagree with me, but I don't see that there's a metrical difference between your Beowulf and your Deor, right? With something like Deor being closer to praise poetry without quite being like I don't think if you go through Old English poetry, there's quite as much praise poetry, right? There's not quite as much of the let me talk about how rad Athelstan is, um, where Old Norse poetry is full of that. Um, so maybe that's going on in a way that we just don't see because the people recording Old English literature for us consider that not to be something to write down. I don't know. Uh,
Well,
but I,
certainly that is an example of praise poetry that seems to be in the Eddic type meter, right?
Cadman's hymn.
oh, Cadman's hymn. Sure, sure, sure. But that's, yeah, religious praise poetry. Yeah, that's true. But I don't think that's also, that's metrically just like typical what from a Norse perspective would be Eddic poetry, right? That's not anything special, is it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
especially if you believe that it's just a farmer who was inspired
Oh, right.
to
Yeah,
come up with this, and then it was recorded by, you know, is it Bede? I can never remember.
it's
The
Indeed,
vener
right? Yeah, I
Yeah,
don't.
it's recorded by the Venerable Bede, and so. But if this is just a farmer, this is should not be part of the larger, you know, uh,
Yeah, true.
poets remembrancing tradition.
But I
Um,
mean, yeah, who knows what the actual story is? And of course, as an Old Norse guy, I'm contractually obligated to dismiss and demean anything associated with Old English. That's, there's a line in the sand that I'm like obligated not to cross, um, even though we obviously read each other's stuff. Um, what else was I was actually going to say something else about this, and what was it? I think one thing that occurs to me is we may be sort of in fits and starts in different corners of the English speaking world, reinventing something like somewhat elaborate praise poetry. Like, I think that rap music occasionally borders on being pretty elaborate praise poetry. I think that something like Cockney rhyming slang occasionally borders on being about as elaborate as Norse kennings. I think that there may be some larger cultural drive toward um, sucking up poetry or talking about how awesome I am poetry being weirdly elaborate. Um, I don't know what's behind that. That might be a question for psychologists. But let's look at how this is organized because actually, in a way, Drukvad is easier to talk about just because it's like, yeah, this is how it works. But how it works is pretty elaborate. So, and I've got plenty of examples to try to show how this works. So each stanza is 8 lines. Each line is 6 syllables. We do have the option to have 2 unstressed syllables and 1 drop. That's fine. So it can be 7 syllables. Then in the even line, the first lift, which is the first syllable, I can't follow a bunch of unstressed syllables like in Eddic poetry. The first syllable is a lift, and it alliterates back with both, well, because there can be more than two, with 2 lifts and the preceding odd line. Each line ends in a trochee, stressed, unstressed. That, okay, in Snorri's image, each line is a plank and it has a nail in it. And the nail is the second to last syllable, okay, the last lift. So the nail, if you want to use his image, has to be in skothending, that is partial rhyme, in odd lines. So let me show you, for example. Often the first line is ignored, but hell, dull, they both end in LL, and we ignore usually inflectional endings. Ut, weet, they both end in T. Liot, braut, they both end in T. So this is what Snorri calls the nail syllable, the second to last syllable. That's the one that always participates in rhyme or half rhyme, sometimes not in the first syllable, first line. Uh, there's also this modified form of Drokrat, which is semi-common, where it's actually the final syllable is the nail, but same principle. GG, GG, TT, TT. Well, GG, GG, vowel, vowel, because these syllables both end in vowels. It's considered Scoth ending. P, P, and then KK, KK, drk, rekum. Gotta have more examples of this. So I know I threw in a bunch. He also leaves it out in the first line, but TT, TT, GG, and he also leaves it out in the seventh line. So, but Gisli's a monster. Okay. And then in even lines, the nail fully rhymes. Oh yeah, over there.
I mean, the rhyming here I always found quite interesting because this doesn't follow what we would normally think of the rules of syllabification. We're rhyming frequently with something like baura, where ra should really be in the onset of the next syllable.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and so it's a little bit funny that it's you know, Trauch, that's fine, but Baura, it shouldn't be there. Of course, if you're looking at Prakosh and Prakosh's law, he says that the first syllable of a word needs to be heavy,
yeah. Mhm.
so the stressed syllable really wants to attract the onset of the following syllable into
Right.
it. And so this sort of looks like evidence for that, but if you're looking at something like Seethon, you really want the rhyme to be C,
Yeah.
not seethe. But does maybe this tells us something cool about the actual syllable structure of these things, that they were really considering the codas of these first syllables to contain the onsets of the next syllables.
Absolutely. I think that this is really good evidence for precocious law because the the uh, the coda of the root syllable pretty much seems to attract whatever consonants it can. Weirdly, though, not inflectional endings on the same word, right? So like this genitive S is left out here in terms of counting, but they'll actually count it across word boundaries. They'll have word final, they'll have a word that ends in a vowel, and they'll actually count the onset of the next word in Scott ending. Like I was looking for examples of that before we came together today, and I didn't spot any. Maybe because I've got all of House Long here. Maybe if I dig through this long enough, we'll notice one. But like kind of here, like this is across a word boundary in a compound tooth and teeve.
Yeah.
Um, that's in Skoltending. Um, Gorthlir, Thjats, Fats, Sog, Seg, Moats. No. If you dig into this long enough, you'll find them just being absolute freaking monsters about this. They'll separate prefixes from the words they belong to, right? That's unseparated from what it actually goes with. Uh, they're awful. Uh, I think part of what maintains my sanity, which well enough, right? But part of what keeps me relatively sane, relative to what I could be, is that I'm still sort of judging them while I'm doing this. I'm still like, you're being too precious, man. Like I don't get down and say this is awesome. I just like, okay, that's what you chose to do with it. So all right. Like I don't bend myself into pretzels trying to say these are the greatest poets of all time. No, these guys are cutting corners and being cutesy too. But and actually pretty often they're cutting corners and being cutesy. Um, and Snorri is no exception. If you read through, so I've been translating the Prosa. That's my next book, and I've been working my way through Hatatal, where Snorri explains supposedly. I'm going to put this in heavy scare quotes, 102 different skaldic meters. But when he says it's a different meter, sometimes it'll just be like, oh, but we use this figure of speech. It's like, man, You cannot count this as a different meter just because you're like, you know, just because you're I don't know, using like metonymy or something, right? But that's what he'll do, and it's sort of maddening. And then Snorri also is the laziest kenning maker on the planet. So it's these guys, we don't have to give them all the breaks in the world. Okay, so here's a stanza, and you can see all of this for yourself. We've got 8 lines, 6 syllables per line. Her hek van restan. Each line ends in a trochee. Restan barða helle bauga uta síðan ljóta breiða. Each even line begins with a lift. That lift alliterates with 2 lifts from the preceding odd line. Ha, 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 da, 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 vowel, 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 la, la, la. The nail or second to last syllable fully rhymes in the even lines with another lift in the same line. Harð, varð, baug, draug, síð, skíð, breið, leið. And the nail is in skothending, that is half rhyme with another syllable in the same line in odd lines. Hell, dol, ut, veit, ljót, braut. Often the first line is left out. And if you're just a jerk like Gisa, you might leave it out in the 7th line too. The fact that it's left out so often in the first line, I think, has to be a legitimate part of the tradition, even though Snorri doesn't mention it as such, because you see it all the time. It's like all the time you just see them leave it out in the first line. When it happens in a different line, I'm more inclined to think that we just don't have it well preserved. If you go to the Skaldic Poetry Project, which by the way, let me show you. Have you looked at that in class?
We have not, but because we were just starting on meter this time. But yeah, please show.
Okay, yeah, let me show you how this can look because it's an extremely well done website at the University of Copenhagen. So they're still working through this and publishing a lot of this as actual in books. So like for a certain number of years after they've published it in a physical book, they won't show the fully edited text online. But for some of the ones that are sufficiently old, they've got to edit it. Okay, yeah. So here's like a fully edited text. So we have, and notice they present as half lines what I'm presenting as full lines, or some of the editors do. Kariel and Gata did here. Very nicely done. You can click or hover over each word, and it will show you not just that word in prose order, but it would also show you at least one editor translator's idea of what it means in English, right? Pretty posh. Am I right? I mean, like this is a lot of work, but it saves a lot of other people a lot of work. You can also look at variant manuscript readings that the editor finds important, various notes, etc., etc. But then one of the really impressive things is the text in every different manuscript source. Right?
Amazing.
Pretty sweet. I mean, this is a ton of work. But one thing that you'll notice when you start looking at these manuscript readings, so we've got 5 manuscripts here, they are remarkably different. So very often what you see in an edition of an Old Norse text, other than something like the Poetic Edda, where we basically one manuscript, is people are making decisions from a bewildering variety of possible options. And it can make one edition very, very, very different from another. And I think that often because the people copying this stuff, right, because these poems can be from the 800s, 900s, and they're being copied in manuscripts sometimes to the 1400s. It's not like this guy in the 1400s necessarily knows or cares that much about what he's copying. And, you can get just mush sometimes on the page, and you've got to figure out, like, what was he looking at from an earlier manuscript, or what was he hearing? So sometimes worth being a little skeptical about readings that don't quite add up meter wise. But this is a fantastic resource, skaldic.ku.dk. A lot of credit to the University of Copenhagen, and Taran Wills, one of the organizers, for keeping that going. just an incredible project. All right. And I don't know why I threw this in, except, oh, yes, I know, because the word Draug is in here, and I was looking for all the ones that have toast. But this is a legit variation on Drogvet. It's called Holfnet, so half chopped. This stanza, by the way, actually attributed to King Harald Fairhair. There's a fair number of these stanzas that get attributed to real historical figures, but who knows if they're really by them. Often the age of these poems looks about right for it to be that person, but who knows if the king or whatever was really that good of a poet. But this is basically Drogvet just with ending on a lift rather than ending on a trochee. So it's the same deal. 8 line. Yes, over there.
Oh, I was just going to say there are plenty of other, like Henry VIII has an entire set of poems that are attributed to him, like Greensleeves, for instance, in one of our earlier versions of The Holly and the Ivy is attributed to him. And Alfonso X has, of course, the Cantigas de Santa Maria, which are all courtly poems to Mary that are almost certainly composed in his court and thus get his name. So, this seems to be the technique is if you are a court poet, you just attribute it to the king.
Yeah. But there's not, like, I'll give him this. There's not as much of that probably fake attribution, it seems like, in Old Norse poetry, because there's a lot more stuff attributed to specific named guys at the courts of these kings than there is stuff attributed to the king himself. And this stanza is about, by the way, I don't know, any of you want to read Snorre Sturluson's Heimskringla, where he gets into the history of the kings of Norway. Harald de Hairfair, the first king of United Norway, has a wife who dies, and he remains so devoted to her, so unwilling to bury her, that he leaves her corpse in their bed for years. And this is his poem that he composes supposedly right after his advisors finally convince him to let them drag her body away and bury her. So I carry fear in my heart always, heed me, men. I carry a delusion about the dead woman in my poetry. I let the poem resound from my mouth while it is recited on my tongue. I offer men a right poem. And it's like just empty enough of content that it's like, yeah, I can believe that a king would say this and people would kind of golf clap for him. Like, yeah, very good, sir. Thank you for letting us bury your wife after 3 years. But this works essentially the same way. Even line starts with a lift that alliterates with 2 lifts in the preceding odd line. Ot a ug, draug don dul, dun drop dval, ret rek reg. Didn't bold those, did I? Then the final lift in the odd lines is in Scottending, half rhyme. So ug, neg, møy, da, vowel final, great drop, druk, rek. And then we have full rhyme on that last lift in the even line. Stet, ret, run, dun, laug, draug, drocht, ocht. Yeah. And it turns out, even though he's talking about the like 3-year-old corpse of his wife, the reason the word draug comes up here is because he has a kenning about poetry that he calls it the cup of the undead. And I'm not quite sure why that is, except that maybe it's metonymy for Odin, because Odin is Draugr, he's the lord of the undead. Anyway, weird little kenning. But we should talk about kennings a little bit. Kennings and Hatesy, because that's definitely part of this tradition and worth getting into some. So because we have to alliterate, and this is all going to be true of Eddic and Skaldic poetry, but it's going to be true to a like 100 times greater degree of Skaldic than of Eddic, because in Skaldic poetry, they have such strict rules for what has to alliterate and rhyme and such that, they can almost never really just come out and say what they want to say, right? Try it. If you want to, like, really, it is very educational to take the rules for Drogfad, look at an Old Norse example and say, I'm going to do this in English, I guarantee you that what you write will not be easily parsable, even if you're trying to make it easily parsable, right? Like you have to use weird vocabulary and weird word order to make this work. So because they've got to alliterate all of these names, all of the gods have numerous additional names. Odin has like 80. These are just like in 1 minute the names that came to my mind, right? Odin has Southinger, Hrolfr, Gauter, Ygr. Thor is Florði, Loki is Lofter, which is funny because that actually alliterates the same. Frigg is Hlin. So we can call the gods by any number of alternative names. Eddic poetry does this a little bit, right? Some of the most common alternative names, Heiti for gods, come up some. Ygr for Odin is really common. Again, kind of odd because it alliterates on a vowel anyway. Hlorði, which by the way literally means pig rider, and we don't know why that's the name of Thor. But Hlorði comes up pretty often for Thor, alliterating with H, because what are we talking about Thor in the context of very often? His hammer. So Hlorði hamar, right? Comes up really often. So that's what a Haiti is. It's an alternative name. And then kind of a similar thing is really, really often we refer to the gods not by their name, but by the name of a kinsman. So, for example, Thor is Mela brother, whoever the hell Meli is. Thor is Fjorgen Yarbur, son of Fjorgen. Loki is really, really often Lauvoyarson. Any number of things. So and so's son, so and so's father, so and so's brother, so and so's mother, so and so's daughter, whatever. Very, very common. I mean, for the heroes too. If you're reading like the Saga of the Volsungs, Brynhildr is Búðla Dóttir, or Gunnar's wife, or Atli's sister, or whatever. This is really, really common for getting the alliteration we need. But then there's kinnings, which take this another step. So Beowulf is really the basis of how most English-speaking people understand what a kinning is. Right? People think about these compact little metaphors in Beowulf, like most famously Whale Road. Right? I hear that one every time that I bring up kinning. Somebody says, "I love these Whale Road," and I don't know why that one sticks in people's heads so much, but it does. I'm like, oh, I don't exactly know what there is to love about this. Like, but okay, that is a legitimate kinning because a road is a type of transportation, and the sea is another type of transportation because ships and whales use it as a way of getting around. But we show that we don't mean road, we actually mean the sea by the determinate word, which is whale. So Old Norse poets, I think, would kind of look at Whale Road and say, that's a little simple for my taste. Like that's not quite, that doesn't blow my hair back. These skalds, typically what they do is they begin with saying, what is a class of things that the thing I actually want to refer to belongs to? So for example, raven is a bird. Okay, great. We're not going to call it a raven. We're going to call it a different kind of bird. We're going to call it a gosling, a hawk, a cuckoo. These are all real, I'm not making these up. These are real examples. Or sword. Okay, that's a shiny thing, right? Reflects in light. What else reflects in light? Flame. Well, I guess that makes light. Fish, serpent. Okay, shiny thing. So we establish its class, choose an alternative member of the class, and then we use a determinate word, either usually in the genitive, but sometimes as a compound with the base word, and we make our kinning. So Valkyrie's gosling. Again, I'm not making this up. Gosling, it's a bird, but Valkyrie is associated with battle. What's the bird associated with battle? Raven, because ravens eat the dead, and ravens are Odin's bird, right? Okay, Odin's hawk. Well, what's the bird of Odin? It's a raven, so we really mean raven. Battle cuckoo. Like, the only important part of this is that cuckoo is a bird. What's the battle bird? That's a raven. Okay, same thing with like sword, flame of war, right? It's not talking about burning things during war. It's what's a shiny thing that you see during war. It's a sword. Fish of battle. I don't know. It sounds like a weird anime or something, but it's a shiny thing associated with battle. It's a sword. Wound serpent. Well, the important thing is that serpents glisten. They always talk about Fron Ormur, the glistening serpent. So the serpent, the shining thing that causes a wound, that's a sword. Okay. So actually, part of the battle of figuring out kinnings is not just being ready to solve like what is the class of things that's being evoked? What's the real thing from that class that I'm supposed to be thinking about? But also, what are the things they make kinnings about all the time? Because then you're kind of ready for it, right? If you see a combination of two words, one of them in the genitive or a compound of two words, and you can't quite figure out what it is, it's often actually pretty sufficient to get started by thinking, what do they make kinnings of all the time? And ravens and swords are actually both pretty frequent. Weapons in general, they're really, really frequently going to make kinnings about weapons. And then ravens all the time, partially because ravens evoke battle and partially because ravens are so strongly associated with Odin. But the absolutely most common kinnings are kinnings from men and women, because this is usually praise poetry in the scholar tradition. So usually I'm talking about how awesome this other guy is, how wonderful this woman is, or I fought this guy and the cause of it was this woman because we both wanted her and we couldn't agree about that. So we very frequently need to make kinnings for man and woman. If you read the saga of Gisli Sorsson, which is a pretty nice little short saga, really interesting story, I made the questionable decision when I started my most recent Old Norse reading group on Zoom, saying, "Oh, you know what? That's a pretty short saga, and it's got some poetry. That sounds like a nice way to go." I forgot what a tiresome poet Gisli is. Like every stanza, it's basically like, well, figure out the four kinnings for man and or woman, and then proceed with translating it. But he's an especially egregious example, but there's lots of these, and all these examples are from him. So the most common way of making a kinning for man is you take a god's name. That can be any god, doesn't matter. Odin, Balder, Thor, whatever. It can also be one of the heiti for that god. So you can call a man, Gauter, Ugur, Hlorði, whatever. You can call him anything that refers to a god. You can call him any masculine tree as well. So like Roiner, rowan tree, that's masculine, so that can be a man. Apaldr, apple tree, that's masculine, so that can be a man. Whatever, any word for tree that's masculine, that can be our head word. And then the determinant is usually something that refers to battle or weapons or ships. So for example, Gisli calls a man tree runner of the horse vig. So horse tree actually this is really a compound, horse tree of bays. Okay. But these are what go together to make one kinning, tree of ships, right? Horse of, oh my God, no, horse, this is, okay. Horse of bays, that's ship. What is the tree of the horse of bays? The tree of ships, that's a man. Okay. Like weirdly enough, saying bays, horse, tree is a cutesy poetic way of saying dude. Right. And scholarly poetry is absolutely chock full of this. Same thing here. Odin, heiti name for Odin is Gauter. The battle gleams Odin. Man. Okay, because battle gleam is sword. So what's the Odin of a sword? Or Brandalunder, grove of blades. Tree or group of trees. Reference to weapons. Talking about a guy. It's just man. Yes, over there.
I just what's going on here? I can now hear myself. Oh well. The the tree of horse of bays. It looks very much like Vedic, where Vedic does not allow compounds of more than two members, but then in classical Sanskrit you can make these gigantic compound, where you have, the horse is the first member of the second, of that compound, but it has a genitive coming off of its first member, which English can't do it. The bays, the bays horse tree, where you really have to parse the bays and horse together. But Vedic does this exact type of thing, where you can have various genitives and other things as separate words, modifying a first member, which should be inaccessible. But I assume, we can't make three-member compounds in Norse. I mean, I haven't seen any really.
No, it's at least not written that way in manuscripts. Right.
And
This is
so,
going to be written as two words.
but so this sort of technique seems like it has to be um, maybe an archaism in the poetic tradition from which these both descend, that you can make these sort of broken compounds where we would really want to make vagavig be a genitive
Right.
and then put it onto a separate word, runner, but they don't do that.
Right.
Um,
I,
um,
I suspect you're right that if that Vedic parallel sounds so close, that strikes me as that must be a shared archaism. That's really interesting. Um, of course, like I said, in manuscripts, though, you don't see this written out as Våga Vikbrunner. It is Våga Vikbrunner, and this happens pretty often. This is a pretty common type. In fact, this one with woman right here, where I just have the dash because it's followed by a proper name. So the goddess Soga of the sea's flame, Lugaslog, right? It's really Lugaslog that semantically go together. That's gold, the sea flame. So the woman of it. Yeah. It's pretty common in these skaldic kennings. I don't think there's a single example of that in Eddic poetry, though, which is pretty surprising. I may be wrong, but it strikes me as being just a skaldic thing. I read I read the Poetic Edda like so many times that it would scare every trick-or-treater. Uh, and I cannot remember an example of it, though there might be one. Oh my gosh, mister, what are your career prospects like? To which I respond, that's oh my gosh, doctor. Um, but you're not wrong, kid. Um, okay. And then woman, similar deal, but we can take any goddess's name, Frigg, Freya, whatever. Also, by the way, if you've ever read the Prose Edda in Gylfaginning, when Snorri lists all of these goddesses that we never see in stories, right? Like actually, these are three of them, Solga, Stjov, and Air. You're like, where is he getting these? If you look at skaldic poetry, that's pretty much the only place you see a bunch of these goddess names. And I'm not necessarily 100% convinced that these, in fact, I'll be frank, I do not think that there were independent stories about these as independent goddesses. I think these are Haiti for Freya or Frigg that, the skalds happen to remember, and Snorri's like, well, I don't know who this is, but maybe this is a goddess of, um, you know, let's break out the D12 and roll it and say, all right, that's the goddess of healing. That's the goddess. Like, I don't think Snorri necessarily knows what he's doing with these. I think these are probably old Haiti for Frigg or Freya or Devyun, a goddess that we actually do know something about. But the fact that he draws them from skaldic poetry is not surprising because he's kind of addicted to that. But you take a goddess's name or a feminine tree name, oak tree is feminine, for example, and then you add a determinant that refers to clothes, refers to jewelry, refers to something similar to jewelry, like a coin or whatever, and you've got a kenning for woman. So Lugis Log Saga, Saga, goddess of the flame of the sea is gold, woman. Sjoven of seams, like seams in a garment, woman. Heir of coins, woman. Most of the time, I would say more skaldic stanzas have a kenning for man and or woman like this than don't. Extremely, extremely common. Um, don't know why I added that. It's just two lines on a duplicate side, but sometimes kennings for men may involve rings or jewelry too. But really common kenning for man is breaker of rings, hater of money, uh, spoiler of gold, stuff like this. And what that seems to refer to is this notion that, a man who's powerful and wealthy has sort of contempt for all of that wealth, right? He shares it with his loyal followers, right? He's generous with his men. So he hates his rings, he hates his gold. So that's a really common kinning formula for men too. I think you see that in Old English also, if I'm not mistaken. I believe there's a couple of those in Beowulf. And another thing that there's just a ton of kinnings for, probably the next most common thing after man and woman generally, is gold. And if you know the saga of the Volsungs, or the Volsung mythic material more broadly, you'll recognize a lot of kinnings for gold. Things like Otter's Ransom, which is a reference to the Volsung story. The payment for Hreidmar's head or something like that will be a kinning for gold. Anything referring to the cursed treasure in the Volsung story is going to be a big kinning for gold. But the most frequent kinning for gold is bright thing or fire related word of water related word. So flame of the well, spark of the river, ember of the sea, whatever, that all means gold. With reference to the fact that Gunnar and Hogni, at the end of the Volsung tradition, they sink their treasure in the Rhine. It may also be a reference. I mean, I've walked the creeks in my homeland here, and I've seen little flakes of gold in the creek. So maybe that is a reference to something like that too. But I think it's largely a reference to the Volsung story. So when you read a lot of Skaldic poetry, especially in the original, because this is hard to translate and look anything like what it comes from, right? When I translate this stuff for just content, I'm not trying to duplicate these kinnings. I'm just going to say man, I'm going to say gold, because like playing this game with casual readers in English is pretty tough. But when you're reading this in the original or in a very close translation, you start getting into a habit of saying, oh, I see a word for fire. I bet this is part of a kinning for gold. Let me look for a word for water, or vice versa. I see a word for water. Let me look for a word for fire. And you kind of start getting a feel for, oh, I bet I see what's going on here. I bet they're not talking about trees. That's got to be, this is a man. Where's the determinate word that makes this man? It's a part of the skill of reading Old Norse poetry you develop with practice. Yeah, over there.
Aiden on Zoom brought up the point that you could be comparing this to Apumnapat, the grandson of the waters, who is the fire in the water, or I think probably closer, European water deposition. This is a very characteristic old European feature of throwing swords into water and throwing lead cursed depictions into water. I think all over the European archaeological landscape, we find throwing shiny stuff into water, and maybe this is a reflection of the type that, oh well, we find gold in water, so there may be some connection there, and of course water itself is shiny in certain ways, but
Sure.
yeah, this could be also part of an inherited tradition that may even predate the entrance of the Indo-Europeans into this area.
And that's a major context of rune finds, right? Or those bog finds where weapons and often other metallic objects are thrown into bogs, right? So like at Vimosa and Ilderup in Denmark, those are major find sites. Snorri in the Prose Edda does explain this as the reason we do this is because of the Volsung story. So at least that is the contemporary understanding of why these kinnings work. But yeah, there could be a much deeper tradition to it that he's not aware of. I agree with that. If that was in chat, I didn't see it. It's possible if this is a webinar, chat by default may just go to you as the host.
Yeah, it could be. I'll relay things to you as they show up.
Okay, just point it out. So if I haven't seen things that people meant for me to see in chat, that's what's going on. I run
That's the first.
Okay, I run all of my Zoom classes as webinars, and this happens all the time where people mean to send a chat to everybody, and it just lands with me because that's the webinar default. Okay, so yeah, what I was saying is when you read a lot of Skaldic poetry, you just start kind of getting ready for like, okay, basically I am looking for, and this sounds like a joke, but it's like basically I'm looking for the inflected verbs, and then I'm looking for the kinnings for gold and the kinnings for guys and girls, right? Like, and that winds up making it make a lot more sense because as soon as you figured that out, like, what case is man in? Right. then you've kind of eliminated those kennings and you can figure out what the heck this really is saying, because a lot of the poem is just dedicated to saying man in the most obscure way possible. Yeah.
Speak loudly.
Okay, I have a question. Like, when do these kennings like ever relate to the passage that they're in, or are they a literal replacement for the word like man or woman, or are they taken as like a metaphor to like enrich the passage that they're in?
I would think less metaphor, and I would think, to me, and you could certainly disagree about this, I think it's somewhat playful. If I'm calling somebody Balder, for example, I'm gonna instead of, I'm talking about my friend Thorkel. I've got a praise poem for him, and I call him Balder of Shields, a real kenning I've seen for a man. I am not probably referring to the fact that he is about to die. Like, calling him Balder is not shouting out something about Balder, if you see what I mean. Or calling somebody, Gauter, that is Odin. What was that one that we just looked at? Odin of Battle Gleam. I am not trying to compare this guy to Odin specifically, right? I'm probably not calling out that he has an obsession with wisdom or something like that. It's just, it seems like a convenience. And I think that the poets enjoyed doing this, that it was part of their craft, part of their play, if you will. And I think that audiences in the Norse world enjoyed figuring it out. And I think that actually part of what is fun for them is I am not going to get clues from the context. Because, well, I mean, and speaking of context, in Iceland, the landscape is largely treeless. So we're using all these words for trees to mean men and women. It's not because we're seeing trees all around us and we're evoking that, right? It's not like, um, I can imagine maybe in my local context, right? I'm seeing mountains all the time, so I'm going to call somebody, mountain of whatever, just because it's on my mind. I think it's just part of the tradition. You could probably dig into a few of these and occasionally find a place where, like, oh, he called him Balder and he's evoking his imminent death. But I think that it would be fairly rare. Um, Not to say that it couldn't happen, though. Is that half answer that?
This is, of course, just the fight that people have about, Homeric epithets.
Yeah.
Like, do they matter sometimes, or none of the time, or what? And I don't know if it's resolvable, really.
There's an interesting example of what I'm talking about where it clearly doesn't matter. Um, Ólafur Tryggvason is the earliest evangelical Christian king. And so later Icelandic and Norwegian writers are kind of obsessed with him, right? He reigns for 5 years, but we have all kinds of versions of his biography. We have biographies of all the poets that lived with him. We have all of their poetry preserved and their sagas and etc. And he is uh, he is an evangelist, and he tries to get his poets to stop referring to pagan themes. So, for example, he recruits Hallfred of Vanra, that's called Hallfred the Trouble Poet, who's an Icelander. Most of these early poets are, at least according to the Icelanders who write the stories. Um, and he says, you got to stop talking about all this pagan stuff. And Hallfred really struggles with it, right? Like, he's converted, but the whole language of poetry is so based on these heathen references, calling somebody Odin of Battle Gleam or whatever, that he struggles with it, but he does it. And so you wind up with stanzas where he's like, I praise the Christ of Battle Gleam. Or he'll that's not a precise example, but it's that kind of substitution. I can remember a real example where he says, Jesus stands by Yggdrasil judging man. And it's like, man, you like, they have probably maybe heard like a sermon on East. Like, he does not know how, like, he is a fresh Christian, and nobody has really started to explain this religion to anybody except you've got to stop talking about Odin, you got to start talking about Christ. And they don't really know how to yet. They don't have that vocabulary, right? And later generations of Christian poets we'll start occasionally using more sophisticated Christian kennings. You get a few more saints and things like that in there. But these early ones, when they're trying, it's so hard for them. And eventually Oliver says, you know what, this sucks. Just go back to doing what you were doing, but like make it clear that you're Christians. So they'll start with, I praise the creator of the world, Christ. The Oathen of Battle Gleam told me to.
Roberta Frank once told me that we have blacksmithing materials where you'll have a form for making various metal objects, and on one side you'll have a hammer for Thor, and on the other side you'll have a cross.
That's true.
Because they're like, he's the big guy.
I think
You got to praise the big guy.
I know what you're talking about. That mold, which has a mold for making a Mjolnir amulet and a crucifix on the other side, I think that's from Hedeby. So it's Viking Age traders were like, well, I make both my Democrat parking only and my Republican parking only, crappy souvenir sign in the same place because both 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 guys are buying, you know. Um, by the way, another example from Ólafur Tryggvason, and I think it's the same poet, Hallfreðr Vandræði the Skald, because there's a huge body of his poetry. Um, it may be a different poet of his because he has a bunch of them, but I think it was Hallfreðr. Ólafur is walking with Hallfreðr in Trondheim one day, and they see a leather worker and a smith arguing, like they're neighbors and they're having a spat. And Oliver says, "Hey, make a poem about that." And so Hallfreðr, declaims this thing about, like the one who makes the thing that slew Fafnir. He struck like Thor with his hammer. He makes this whole elaborate thing out of just these two peasants arguing. And I think that speaks to the way that they do think of it as, and I use the word not just because I'm trying to be light. I think that it is sometimes pretty playful. Like they're showing off. Like, check out all the references that I can make, even though I'm just talking about, two guys arguing about where the property line is or whatever. It really does often seem kind of playful to me. And that's another way in which I think a similarity to something I'm definitely not an expert on, but my understanding of modern rap is where oftentimes you're just showing off, right? Like look at all the stuff I can rhyme, look at all the ways that I can insult you. Um, and actually, by the way, a lot of Skaldic poetry is insulting too. It isn't just praise poetry. Um, and some of the ways that they insult each other are absolutely fascinating. Like, actually, on a different presentation, I may have this. There's this amazing exchange between these guys in the saga of Bjorn Hitalakapo, where one of them says that the other one is the result of his mom getting impregnated by a fish. Um, it's amazing. Yeah, here it is. From when I was teaching sagas. A fish walked. This actually has end rhyme. So this is Snorri has a name for this, and I can't remember what it is, but a fish walked on land and the tide washed the sand. Oh, I made this rhyme in English when I did this like 8 years ago. Of the lump sunk kin, or such at least was his skin, that wolfish lady ate the gray belly who eats bait. But it's cursed meat, you see. There's a lot of bad things in the sea. And the woman's womb took up a lot of room, so that she walked weighted down all around farm and towns. She had such a big tum-tum, it jutted out like her thumb. It sounds just as like goofy in Old Norse. But a baby boy came to light, and the lady's husband took fright. When she said he'd alight, when she saw her dog eating son, that her fish eating one, she concluded for her part that the boy had a goat's heart. Like I don't know. I think that this was just something that happened to, like, I can make all this rhyme, you know? Because why does he have a goat's heart if he's half fish? Whatever, right? But that there's a fair amount of Celtic poetry that's like that. It just strikes me as like this guy is screwing around. Um, Some of it, of course, is deadly serious. But if you read the prose edda, as I mentioned, about a third of it is Snorri Sturluson showing examples of all these different quote unquote meters and then some actual really different meters. It's 102 stanzas, and all of it, 100% of it, is the rulers of Norway are so cool, they're so generous with gold. Like you could basically translate each stanza the same. Like and this actually was driving me insane for months until I realized that it would be more fun if I translated them with the poetic structure that they have in Old Norse. Here, I'll actually show this to you. But the point of what he's doing is not showing you like, look at all the different things I can say. It's look at all the different things, like ways I can say the same thing. Right. It's the wordplay is the point more than the content even. I'll show you a little sneak preview here of what this looks like. Pull up a nice stanza for you. What's a good
Very much like self-purifying soma in the Vedic tradition. Of you have an entire book of the Rig Veda that's just we are making this ritual substance, and the process is pretty boring, so we're going to describe it as interestingly as possible because this ritual takes a long time.
Kaylee Smith told me about that once. I was start trying to write Skaldic poetry in English. You will understand real fast how hard this is, and how hard it is to actually say stuff that's meaningful.
With regard to meaningful things, in Hauslong we have the word idun spread across two lines. We have id and then uther. How frequently is it that they'll take a word and break it apart? Admittedly, idun is the topic, so it should be extremely salient in the discourse, but
That's not too uncommon. Bragi does it, Geesley does it. Like I can think of examples of both those guys doing it, different from the one you just mentioned, even. Um, they'll actually do that pretty often with names because people's names tend to be compounds, right? So Thorstein, right? Thorstone, or a woman's name like Swan, Hildur, Swan, Battle. So actually, a really pretty common trick to turn somebody's name into a whole stanza, pretty much, or half of a stanza, is you make a kinning for each element of that person's name. So yeah, it'll drive you crazy. So like instead of saying Thorstein, I'll say some kinning for stone, like okay, I can't think of a good kinning for stone.
Mountain's
Swan.
Child.
Yeah, Mountain's Child would actually not be bad. And then Thor, like, the mountain's child of the son of Odin or whatever, right? And all I'm saying is Thorstein. So yeah, they will spread it up across lines, whether it's a kinning or whether it's just a basic name. That doesn't strike me as weird. Actually, later skalds, I think, get a little bit more reluctant about that. I'm not sure why, but early skalds like Bragi and Geesley, I feel like that's pretty common. Um, Swanhilder, I know I've seen that because um, there's this semi-famous fact that in early Iceland, love poetry was illegal, right? Because you are not supposed to compose a poem that the woman might hear that might influence her to fall in love with you without her dad's permission. So that's the idea, that's the theory. Um, so when these guys want to write or compose, I shouldn't use the word write, that's English habits. When they compose a poem about some woman that they're trying to impress, very often they'll conceal her name. So that technique is fairly common there. Like so Swanhilder's a real example because you have to figure it out because the guy says like the the noise of spears of the cuckoo of the marsh or something like that. And it's like noise of spears, battle, the cuckoo, the marsh. What's a bird in a marsh? A swan. And it's like, oh, okay, he's talking about Swan Hill, right? Yeah. And I think in one of those he even conceals the name of her dad just to make it extra confusing. So yeah, they can be terrible like that. And then, they can also, I may have an old presentation where I've got one of these. They can put like six kinnings inside each other, right? You can pile these up to a degree that's just monstrous. Like here's from an old presentation that I did in a class. Naustad lachs lemana givers drevu kim slungvir. That is like multiple levels of one kitting. So boathouses, whites. So color stands for horse. Any color that we can use of a horse stands for a horse. So what is the horse of a boathouse? It's a ship. Okay. The lee side moon of a ship, that's a shield because we put shields on the side of a ship. Okay. Then it's the monster of a shield. That's an axe, the weapon that destroys the shield. Then it's the snowfall of an axe. That's battle because they often liken battle to weather events, right? It's the rainstorm of swords, it's the hailstorm of shields, whatever. The gem, the shiny thing of battle, that's a sword, and the slinger of a sword, that's a man. Right?
We did it.
Yeah. So it's like, it's just it'll drive you crazy. Um, that's a real example. Like I lack the madness to actually generate an equivalent example. Right? All right. Oops. What am I trying to show you? So one thing that I often recommend, we've been working through all these poems by Geesley in this Old Norse reading club I've been running on Zoom, and it's maddening for people, right? Because you're faced with 8 lines of text in a language that you're not that familiar with. You know that half of the words here don't mean what they appear to mean on the surface. Where do you start, right? Like, how do you start pulling at this? And I think color coding can really, really help. Um, and but I'm kind of a sucker for color coding anyway. One of the things that may be worthwhile to note, but is never ever going to be a hard and fast rule, is very, very frequently okay. Each half of the stanza is probably semantically and syntactically independent of the other half. Your first 4 lines probably form a unit that does not require words from the second half and vice versa. So for me, when I punctuate these, I usually don't use any punctuation except a period at the end of the 4th line and a period at the end of the 8th line. By the way, that's as much punctuation as you ever see in the manuscript anyway. And since they mix up word order a lot, I think that works. But the 3rd line in each one, so the third in each half, the 3rd line and the 7th line, often forms a kind of a parenthetical with the first word of the 4th line. Not a hard and fast rule. Do not expect that to always happen, but it can help. So if you start thinking of, weirdly enough, this is how they like to do it, lines 1 and 2 and the last part of 4 as a unit, lines 5 and 6 and the last part of 8 as a unit, but then 3 and the first part of 4 as a unit and 7 and the last part of 8 as a unit, you may be on the right track. Then I say, look for your inflected verbs because there's no such thing as a kinning for a verb, right? The verb is going to be the verb. It's going to mean what it means. So here we've got ovate, and by the way, and this is something that I can spend another 3 hours talking about. These ovs and ums are meaningful very often in the archaic language of Skaldic Enetic poetry. They often do adjust the semantics of the verb that follows them. Not always, but they can. So I typically treat them as a unit with the verb. Ovate, knows, dragi, may draw. Okay, those are some inflected verbs. Moon, will, segya, they say, regium, let me take action. Okay, so typically we can kind of sort these into semantic units based around our inflected verbs, right? So when we pull this apart and put it into prose order and we put everything that's one color together, we can watch for how there's usually, one inflected verb per clause. Where ovate, who knows? Nema Gisli dragi heldris or sponum. Unless Gisli may draw his battle ice, his sword, out of the sheath. And there again, by the way, shiny thing, ice of battle. Right? The family of men will learn the opportunity. As victory trees, men say to the decorator of a ring, for some reason that's a kenning for man, Thorkettle is dead at the thing. He's Rothen, he's advised. They often use that as whatever reason that participle means killed. Dricium dod until deuda, let me take action, let me perform a deed, still until death, up till death. It doesn't make this easy, but being aware of that often parenthetical third line or seventh line helps a little bit in pulling this apart. It is not a hard and fast rule. But also, like I said, find and if you're working through, I'm a mauler of books, right? I'm a guy who just I mark everything up. So like in our copy of Gisli Saga or my copy of Gisli Saga that we're reading from, I just go through and write all over these stanzas, right? Just pulling it into prose order and then trying to figure out the kennings. It's not an easy task, but finding those inflected verbs and keeping in mind that parenthetical third line are my two biggest tips, in addition to just saying, if I see fire or water, probably talking about gold. If I see tree or god or goddess or anything about clothes or jewelry, probably talking about men and women, right? Look for those kennings, look for those inflected verbs, look for those parenthetical third lines. Just some tips that can help make that a little bit more approachable. Does that help?
It must.
Yeah,
We have
yeah.
another question.
Can I
Yeah.
ask a question about these kennings? Like, does it have anything to do with maybe like not kind of an aversion to naming, like, because they're typically apparently gold swords, men and women, so maybe like an aversion to naming something. I know in languages sometimes cultures don't want to name something directly.
Hmm.
Like, I don't know, not like maybe like a not necessarily a fear, just kind of like, oh, they don't really do that, especially in poetry. Maybe it's like in an audience, you don't want to name something specifically. I don't know.
I don't think that there's that kind of taboo going on because, for example, in Epic poetry, they're not shy about naming anyone or anything. And even though they use a certain number of those Heiti, those alternative names, your Hlorrithi for Thor, your Igr for Odin, those are so common that I'm sure just about everybody knew, the really common ones anyway, at least the top three or whatever. I think more what it is again that kind of playful showing off where, what are we talking about? We're talking about men and women interacting, we're talking about fighting, we're talking about the gold that we want to be paid by a king. We're going to talk about, another thing that can be a subject of kennings is particular, like lands, countries, regions, um, where you have to be a little bit familiar with Scandinavia to know what they mean by, the like what's an example of this? Like the Vik of stones. It's like, okay, so what's the area that's kind of like Vik, the area around Norway, but it's area around Oslo, but it's really stony, right? Like you have to kind of figure out what they mean by that kind of stuff. I think it's that these are the things you refer to so much that they don't want to bore or unimpress their audience by just talking about them plainly. Like to just use a word that means man is like you're losing as a scald. You don't get any scald points for that. But if I can say man by saying, the boathouses, horses, lee side moons, uh, trolls, snowfalls, gem slinger, it's like that's 55 scald points right there. Right. And I actually kind of think that's not a bad way of thinking about it. It's like I'm trying to score points, right? I've got to score a certain number of points in this stanza. I have to show you that I can talk about this stuff indirectly enough. Um, Snorri will actually use this term Ovliost, like too clear, right? And I think what he's getting at is actually a pretty legitimate part of this tradition is like part of the idea of skaldic poetry isn't so much that it's a taboo, it's that this is about showing off. And if you're not showing off, what are you doing? Right? Like you might as well just go compose Voluspa, man. What do you do? What are you doing talking about Oliver Tryggvason? Um, Go home and tell your kids a story about Thor because that's all your straightforward Eddic poetry is good for. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, one more question.
Yeah, sure.
On that topic, I'm wondering how separated the people who compose slash recite skaldic poetry versus epic poetry versus things like laws are, because it's such different techniques and traditions in various ways.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I think you can often tell when if you go through the Poetic Edda and read it in the original, there are a few poems that will strike you and make you say, "Oh, this is by a skald. This is by somebody who wants this to be a skaldic poem." Some examples of that: Hymiskvida, the poem about Thor and Tyr retrieving the cauldron, full of kennings in a way that no other poem about the gods are. And it also has really elaborate word order tricks. To me, it look and the little parenthetical lines, often third or seventh line. To me, it's like this is a guy we don't know who this is because none of the Eddic poets ever name themselves. The skalds do, but the Eddic poets never do. It's like this could be by, a Gisli or an Egil or a Halfred. This could be a skaldic poet we know because this is somebody who works in that tradition and wants to work in that tradition even here. Like he can't help but show off in those ways. Other poems that are like that, the three poems about Helgi that begin the heroic poems in the Poetic Edda, full of kennings in a way that's unusual for Eddic poetry. Atlakvida, the poem about the death of uh, Gudrun's brothers and then her murder of her husband Attila uh, for killing them, full of weird word order tricks and some weird kennings. Maybe not quite as much as Hymiskvida and the Helgi poems, but that looks to me like this is a skald. This is somebody who wishes he were working in that tradition. But then it's also remarkable that for the most part, that body of Eddic poetry really isn't like that. It feels like people who are pretty comfortable just working within the clearer, simpler Eddic tradition. You don't feel like the poet of just to use famous examples, Voluspa or Hávamál or Thrymskvida wishes he were making more kennings, right? It's like drop it in now and then. The poet of Voluspa will say like enemy of branches for fire, and it's like, all right, that's cute, but like that's the one time that you see a kenning there. So I think that there is probably a Venn diagram of Eddic and Skaldic poets that really doesn't overlap completely. It's some people who do both, but probably the ones who learn to do Skaldic poetry, that's considered so much more prestigious that even when they do Eddic poetry, it's like, well, I got to kind of show you that I know how to do this. As to people who are composing other kinds of literature like laws, of course, the laws are probably orally recited uh, by, I mean, supposedly it's in Iceland anyway, it's the law speaker, the Lögsögumaður, who's reciting one third of the law orally at every annual thing. Um, I think that law often has a lot in common with traditional poetry because it's something that's supposed to be passed down over ages and ages and often has poetic features. But law texts are supposed to be fairly clear, and I don't see much overlap with skaldic poetry, just a lot of penchant toward alliteration and stuff like that that helps people remember things. But an interesting case there may be Snorri Sturluson, who is a chieftain, a Gothi, and is a compulsive skaldic poet, um, with his 102 stanzas about how awesome the kings of Norway are, and also an amazing memory for skaldic poetry. Um, the second part of Snorri Sturluson's prose Edda, Skaldskaparmal, is just full of him quoting massive amounts of text and skaldic poetry, and he seems to know it orally because in other sources where the same poem will be attested, it'll have significant differences of wording from what Snorri remembers. So he seems to know it by head. Same thing with the Eddic poetry he knows. When he quotes Voluspa, it's often just different enough from our two manuscripts of Voluspa that it looks like he knows it orally from a different source than either manuscript. I don't know if that's quite what you're asking. Speaking of poetry that Snorri preserves in Skaldskaparmál, Houselong, right? That's where it's preserved. It's just Snorri saying like, yeah, he's talking about stories about Thor and kennings for Thor, and then he says, oh, here's a big story that the old Olver Okrinis tells, and that's where it comes from.
Thank you.
If that half answered that. I realize that might have just been rambling. Well, do you want to, what's useful to you? You have like 20 minutes, right? Do you want to look at Eddic poetry? Do you want to talk about Houselong? What's the most useful thing I can do for you?
Let's look at Eddic poetry. I think that makes sense.
Okay. What should I pull up?
I think we're reading Voluspa next.
Oh, you are? Okay.
And then Thrumskvida, and then Baldur's Dream after that.
Okay. I actually have my own edited text of Voluspa. I also have my own edited text of Havamal, which is published. It's the Wanderer's Havamal. But I teach Voluspa with this text where I have the Codex Regius text here, the Hauksbok text here, some notes, and then the images of the manuscript. So this was a little bit of work. But actually, and you can see just from looking at this very page, some ways that meter can help us resolve some questions about text sometimes. And this is something that heavily influenced the changes that I made in the second edition of the Poetic Edda vis-a-vis the first edition. Because when I had the first edition published in 2015, I tended to favor the text in the Codex Regius manuscript, which is from about 1270. I don't know how many of you know about this, so I'll just give you the basics. But there's another manuscript of the poem Voluspa, which is in Hauksbok, a manuscript from the early 1300s. So I always tended to favor the Koningsbok text just because it's older. But in fact, metrically, the Hauksbok text is often a little bit better. So Voluspa begins Hljóðs bið ek allar kindir in Voluspa, in the Codex Regius manuscript. But this line is short. Now you can try to resolve that by moving allar to this line. Some people do. But then what are you like? We have a problem here because there's still, what are we alliterating? Kindir doesn't alliterate with anything in one. If we move allar down here, we can make allar alliterate with ek, but alliterating on a pronoun is really, really strange. That's like the last thing that you would ever alliterate on, pretty much. So it's a little weird. But if we look at Hauksbok, we have a nice fix for it. Hljóð spidek allar helgar kindir. We've got these nice hus that alliterate. So I actually think that an understanding of meter has helped me appreciate that both of these manuscripts have value, and that sometimes even Hauksbok is a little bit better. And then I have a bunch of metrical notes here, like, this is a little bit too much anacrusis for an Eddic poem. We'd expect this probably to be Thaus, which is a form we see attested pretty often. I don't print it that way because I don't feel like I'm quite entitled to amend the text quite that much, but I mentioned that that's a really likely thing. So notice here, pretty nice, straightforward example of Fournier, this log. We've got our lifts alliterating here. Helg Theoth, Mog, Mary, Min, Vel, Vil, Vol, or Vol over here is probably a better reading. And then Fremst, Foreign Fear, with a pretty surprising amount of anacrusis again for an Eddic poem in that last line, but that's how it's preserved. So that's straightforward Fournier, this log. And then if you look at Havamal, like I'll pull up So not to make this all advertisement, right? But I have an edition of Havamal, bilingual edition. So this is just that. You can see that this is, well, these are the magic spells that I was looking at for you earlier. So that's Galdrelog. But if we go back to the main proverbial part of it, these very nice, often triangles of increasing length, right? That's your Leo the Halter with two lifts that alliterate in that third line, and then lifts that alliterate with each other in the first and second, or the Halter, and then increasing anacrusis as you go down the triangle. So let me show you another poem that might be interesting for you to look at. Where do I have my text of it? It's probably in my advanced Old Norse class stuff. Just give me a moment. So in Fafnismal, the poem about the conversation of Sigurður and the dragon that he's just killed, Fafnir. After Fafnir finally dies, Sigurður drinks his blood and can suddenly understand birds. Probably most of you heard some version of the story, right?
That's good science.
It is science, yeah. So some of the birds speak in Fornir the Slag, and some of the birds speak in Ljóðahaldur. So all three of these poems about young Sigurður, actually, so Regnsmal, Fafnismal, Sigurdrífamal, actually alternate between Fornir the Slag and Ljóðahaldur to some extent. And it may be, it's really hard to tell. It may be that what you've got is actually multiple poems about young Sigurður, some in Ljóðahaldur and some in Fornir the Slag, that have all been kind of sewn together. Or it could be that the poets are trying to distinguish between different speakers by saying, like, well, this is a bird that speaks Fornir the Slag, and this is a bird that speaks Ljóðahaldur. We don't really know, right? I mean, it's pretty hard to tell. Age-wise, they all look about the same. But just as a minor sort of comprehension quiz, 32, what is the meter? Like Fornir the Slag or Ljóðahaldur.
Anyone?
Fornir the Slag?
This is Fornir the Slag.
Yeah.
Yep.
How can you tell?
It's not in six.
Is that what?
And it's not in 6 lines.
Yeah.
And yeah, the alliteration patterns.
Yeah, the count of lines is not necessarily going to be your strongest indication, because you can get those extra third lines in Ljóðahaldur, and you can get a lot of extra lines in Fornir the Slag sometimes. But yeah,
The anacruses are not as strong either.
Yeah.
I mean, you do have an anacrusis in the 4th line, but otherwise it's pretty stable in that respect.
Yeah, that's a very solid indication too. Yeah, and we don't have those triangles. It doesn't build up. We don't get more anacrusis as it goes, which is pretty characteristic of Ljóðahaldur. Yeah. And in our typical way, we see alliteration, the first lift of the even line with a lift in the preceding odd line. Von, fjord, spill, spak, fun, foft, spate, sig. All right. What about, well, you can tell even from 34. What about 37?
Well, the 3rd and the 6th line have internal alliterations,
Yeah.
which is pretty, and also the 6th line has a lot of anacrusis.
Yeah, it's out of control. But that's so characteristic of Ljóðahaldur, yeah. Do you see what alliterates in 1 and 2?
What was that, Tony?
Not the vowel.
Tony suggesting the vowels.
I think it's got to be the vowel if there's not something wrong here. Interesting fact is the only syllable that can cause a non-initial syllable to alliterate is o, un. They're really inconsistent about whether this alliterates with a vowel or whether what follows alliterates with whatever it would alliterate with. But svither wouldn't alliterate with sparir, right? Because spa needs to alliterate with spa. So it is probably intended to be O and N. Oh, that un prefix and then this adverb still, yet. Adverbs are pretty weak things to alliterate on, but it's not preceded. There's no noun or adjective in that line, so you got to have something. So I think that's right, but it's a little surprising, like a weak kind of word to alliterate. So it's probably Osfeather, N, and then yeah, Fjond, Folk, Reg, Roth. Once again, you have Roth. Rothen as like this word means a million things in poetry. It can mean killed, betrayed, whatever. And then Sleek Seal, with that mountain of Anacrusis before it. Very, very difficult poem in a lot of ways, actually, Fafnismal. Not just for the fact that we're jumping back and forth between meters, but this poem doesn't seem to be very well preserved. There's several places where it's like, I don't know what's going on. And in fact, I point that out in the introduction, the second edition. This is like, I think this poem has the line that is the most disagreed about in all of Old Norse literature. Which is this awful thing. It's actually not what it looks like in the manuscript. O bornum scioro scathe. Where is it on here? I always like to have the manuscript text ready when I'm reading with students so I can show them, just how bad it can be. Although, if you've never seen the Codex Regius of the Poetic Edda before, you might notice it's in pretty nice, readable handwriting, actually. Okay, I can't spot it off the top of my head. But at any rate, nobody agrees about what this says. What meter is it?
Well, it's Ljodahator again. You can see the 3 and 6 alliterating internally.
Yeah.
We have H alliteration in 1 and 2. We have F alliteration in 4 and 5. Obornum being but you can have. Oh yes, you mentioned that you can have 3 lifts in the third line or the 6th line.
Yeah, there. You don't have to, but they can. Yeah. Also, this poet does something that Snorri says you shouldn't. He has 2 alliterations in a even line, but whatever. Eddic poets are not strictly trying to follow Snorri, and this person probably lived a long time before Snorri. But this last line nobody agrees about, right? Skjor means magpie. Scathe is a course or a spoon. Obornum, unborn, uncarried, something like this. This is who encouraged you. This is the dragon asking Sigurd why he killed him. Who encouraged you? Why did you let yourself be encouraged to take my life? You glistening-eyed boy, you had a bitter father. And then on an unborn, a magpie on a course. Nobody knows what on earth that's supposed to say. It's obviously pretty heavily distorted. But yeah. There are other things I could do with Eddic poetry that would be useful to you toward the end of this? Has this, folks tell me, has this been a jumble or has this been semi-coherent?
This has been very coherent.
Hey, look, I have to ask. It's not my kind of question, but I mean, we obviously have these very clear preferences. I mean, so everybody seems to agree on generally on what kinds of things like to alliterate, and that there are sort of preferences, right? Like
Yeah.
nouns and adjectives over verbs, and maybe adverbs are somewhere in the middle, or maybe they're below verbs, but they're better than pronouns. Like all those books, like you showed me that book by that nice Japanese guy about these verses. Does he like count these up and try to quantify it in some way, or is this just like this is just sort of an impressionistic sense that mostly the alliterations occur on nouns and adjectives and so on.
I would say for me, or for Zverse, it's impressionistic. I am pretty sure I have not read every single page of this, I will admit, because it takes 20 minutes to read every page of this. But he quantifies just about every claim that he makes in this book. This book is half math. So I suspect that somewhere in here that claim may be quantified, but I have not completely, made my course through this, which would be a large order. I would say that the tendency to alliterate on nouns and adjectives is so overwhelming that it is really striking when they don't do it. It's like, oh, weird, right? Like not that you think, oh, this is illegitimate or this is wrongly copied, but it's like it's as weird as at UCLA meeting somebody who's from LA, right? It's like, oh, you like grew up in Westwood. Weird, right? Like it's not like it's not unthinkable, but it's like everybody's from somewhere else. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
It happens. It's just not often. So,
Any other questions? We can also end early.
you go till 45, right? Or is it till 50?
I think it's till 50. Oh, Tony has more questions.
Okay.
Sorry, that was.
Oh, that wasn't a raised hand. Okay.
I'm curious about like his career after like he became independent.
Our new grad student who is an author is always looking forward to leaving academia and becoming a publisher of books.
Yeah, sure. I mean, just as on a different subject. Yeah, so I got hired at UCLA when Old Norse was taught in the Scandinavian section in 2011. I was a replacement for a tenure track professor who, long story omitted. Some people know this story. But so I was there for 3 years. I actually had not gotten my PhD yet. I was ABD at Wisconsin, and I got my PhD the same year that the UCLA job ended in 2014. I was adrift then. Uh, I didn't know it was going to end until the very end of the school year, pretty much. And I wound up just looking for work back closer to home. So I worked at a little museum in Wyoming for a year. That was the year that the first edition of my translation of the Poetic Edda came out, and it did pretty well. I was targeting just a general audience, people who weren't very, academically. It wasn't meant to be just a textbook. It was meant to tell kind of anybody, well, here's what these poems say. And that kind of took off more than my publisher or I expected. So I started making YouTube videos too. And by the time that I got hired at Berkeley next year, and I worked there from 2015 to 17, I started looking for ways to supplement my income there, which wasn't enough to cover my living expenses, with reaching out to the public. So I continued to translate, and I had a second book published while I was at Berkeley, a translation of the Saga of the Volsungs. But I also started a YouTube channel, which I did that because I read somewhere around this time that people trusted what they saw on video more than what they just heard. So I thought, podcast or YouTube or blog, and supposedly video was considered most trustworthy. So I started a YouTube channel, and I started a Patreon account to support the YouTube channel, where people donate a certain amount every month to support what you're doing. So I continued to do that, continued to teach. I got hired back at the University of Colorado in 2017. And by 2019, I was making more from Patreon than I was from the University of Colorado. And since these were all untenured positions, untenured, not, lecturer positions, uh, there wasn't a lot of stability to it. I wanted to stay in Colorado because my family was here. Um, and I thought, well, maybe I should actually cut the cord myself and see if I can support myself just from this, because otherwise I'm just going to be teaching the same classes at the same salary forever, if I even get to stay here. So I cut the cord in 2020, and since then, my income has been mostly Patreon. Books are a decent part of it. I did the Great Courses Norse Mythology class, if you can believe that. That's not actually a big earner or whatever, but it's an example of the other kind of stuff I do. I do public talks, a certain amount of movie and video game consulting and stuff like that, and it stitches together an income. So that's me. I mean, it's not an example that absolutely everybody could do, because probably not that many people can occupy that niche for one subject. But I have encouraged other people to try doing it for similar subjects, or people to do it for Old Norse who can do it better than me. That's fine too. I don't know what your particular focus is, but yeah, it's worked okay. And I think originally there was a certain amount of skepticism from some of the academic community about it, like, can you actually do something rigorous on YouTube? But I think that over the years, the fact that I have not, had a public um, like psychotic breakdown, which seems to afflict so many social media. I mean, hey, it's a thing. It seems like a lot of people, they start talking to the public and they go crazy. Like, it is a phenomenon. But the fact that I've been doing this so long, and that it hasn't happened, that you know about, right? Um, and I keep inviting people. I mean, Tony, you've been on the channel several times. I like to invite people to actually talk about their own subjects, right? Like, if I read something about, interesting about an archaeological find, I'm not an archaeologist. I'm going to try to actually get the person who published about this, like, come talk to us about it. Come tell the public, come answer questions from people that don't know anything about this. So I've tried to make this also a forum for other people in my field and adjacent fields. And, it's all right. It's not, I'm not going to say it's a cushy living, but it's a living. So does that sort of answer the question?
I think YouTube science education is at least huge. I think there are so many really good science educators out there.
You're touching the lives of all the young Indo-Europeanists. The number of the young students who came up to me at the Arbeitstagung in September and were eager to tell me the first thing, I really like these YouTube videos that you do with Jackson. I just love that YouTube channel.
Wow.
Was pretty much every single one, like, uniformly under the age of 25. Yeah. So it's a thing.
I'm super surprised by that. Although people love the videos with you, Tony. Like, I've had people, and this is more praise for you than it is dissing me, I guess. But like, it's like, I only watch this for the Tony videos.
I think it's a small constituency, but let's do another one soon. I actually have to get going, but yeah, but we're overdue. We'll talk about it.
Yeah, we are overdue. Maybe we should have Juliet back.
Shit, I have that email from her. Thank you for reminding me.
And I know Aiden here also got into Indo-European studies through your videos.
The reason I found this program, for better or for worse.
Wow.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I'm astonished at that. It's a surprise to me always, because I don't really meet people who watch my videos, right? Like, except unless I'm doing a public event for them. Like, I don't run into people who are like, I watch your videos, right? It doesn't happen much. So that's very meaningful to me. Thank you for telling me that. I didn't know.
Cool. Thank you.
Well, that's why we were so excited to have you. And with that, I think let's thank our speaker. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much. And reach out to me. Feel free to, share my email with anybody, John. I'm happy to answer questions from anybody who's got follow-up questions or whatever else.
Could we have your slides?
Yeah, sure. I'll send them to you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, have a lovely day, and come visit us.
I would love to. Let's talk about it.
Yeah. Bye.
All the best.
Yeah, you did the thing.